Sochi couldn't sleep on the ship that was bringing them all to the Naglfari. While she laid in the bottom bunk looking up at the mattress above, her husband, Michikoto, or Mitch to his friends, slept soundly in the top bunk. And across from Sochi was Maria, Michikoto's cousin. This all wasn't news to Sochi. Maria worked hard and retained a lot of information, but when she wasn't working, she was often sleeping. So naturally she could sleep through the motion. And Michikoto, being her cousin, naturally inherited some of that too. Sighing to herself, Sochi got up and quietly walked to the deck of the ship. She wasn't an expert on ships, so she couldn't say what kind of boat it was. She did know it was a vanguard ship, often used in search and rescue operations. A large green caduceus on the flag on the back of the ship fluttered while it moved as quickly as it safely could from Isle City to the Naglfari, somewhere in Oceanus. Around Sochi's ship, other boats followed along. Most of them were also vanguard, including a very large floating hospital, a ship made for the treatment of thousands, made from an old converted oil tanker. Other boats weren't part of the vanguard fleet, but they were still here to help. 2 or 3 of the boats were from hunters from the guild who wanted to help out today, especially once they heard about the bounty for helping out. One final ship that didn't belong to the vanguard fleet was a very fancy yacht that was leading the ships to the Naglfari, owned by one Ian Avid, an insurance adjuster whose company was supposed to pay out for the loss of the Naglfari. Naturally, cruise ships are very expensive, well over 1 billion centi just in construction, not including things like stock, staff, and seasoning, all of which adds up pretty quickly, and the loss of which only raises the amount of money insurance is paying out to the cruise company. So naturally, it was the job of someone like Ian Avid to try and recover some of the money back. He had to go out and see how badly damaged the ship was, see if any of the stock could be recovered, if any of the staff survived, and of course, if the ship itself could be recovered. Even if the ship was only sailing scrap and shattered steel, that was still salvageable centi, compared to, say, 1 billion centi of rust on the bottom of the ocean. And that was where people like Sochi and the Vanguard came in. Ian was paying every volunteer who was here to help him reclaim the ship 2 million centi each. Everyone from the doctors, nurses, hunters, sailors to the hands were all being paid 2 million each. Why so much? Well, the job had a lot more risk than a standard salvage job. 9 hours ago, the captain called the Vanguard for assistance, stating that there was likely an outbreak of Samedi Syndrome on the Naglfari, and immediate aid was needed. There hasn't been contact with the ship since that message, which leads to the worst possible conclusion. A ship with 6,000 Samedi Syndrome sufferers waiting to create a cataclysm with anyone who collided with the cruise ship. So, high risk naturally led to high rewards. But it still led to a net positive for the insurance agency. Even if 300 people volunteered, each being paid 2 million, that was still less than the billion the insurance was expecting to get out of the ship. And if Sochi was to guess, there were maybe 100 volunteers in this fleet, and not everyone was a hunter. There was her husband. There was Claudius Clyde Caron, the ghost hunter, Henry Hanno, the navigator, Talia Tybalt, the true tactician, and Bethany Brixham, the brigand of Bath. 6 hunters and quite possibly 6,000 sufferers. The sun started to rise in front of Sochi, and as her breath visibly fogged the early motion air, she whispered to her help, "This is going to be easy." she said to herself as she started to see the ship silhouetted in the sunrise. Not long afterwards, everyone else woke up and gathered on the floating hospital deck. There, Ian was standing on a box of ropes while everyone gathered and muttered around. The doctors and nurses bunched together, all of their blue scrubs with a prominent green caduceus in a white circle. The circle was a symbol of neutrality. It showed that they were just professionals doing their job, apolitical and willing to work for any side. Useful if going into a war zone, or in a fight between heroes and villains. The hands, sailor staff, who were essential for keeping boats running, were still dressed in their work clothes. No symbols nor any iconography. They couldn't risk having any. But they were the most populous group, and they were assembled with everyone at Maria's request, even though Ian didn't want them to be. She wanted everything in this meeting to be clear to everyone. And the final and smallest group was the hunters themselves. Sochi was in her husband's arm while they stood near the front, not wanting to miss a single word. Sochi's hand rested on the crest on her husband's chest. A golden heater, with antlers growing out of it, with a single green line bisecting it. A match to the crest on Sochi's chest. The heater was an old symbol for representing protection, being the same shape as a shield. Even in this modern day, it still represented someone who sees themselves as a shield to the dangers of the world. Not a sword. Not merely a hunter, but a hero. And so she could feel the stares from the other hunters. Almost no other hunters took on the mantle of hero anymore. Most hunters were like Claudius and Talia. They did a job and they didn't try to proclaim themselves as heroes. Their crests were simple circles. Claudius's crest was a ghost with a target in his head within the circle, and Talia's was a simple diagonal purple stripe through the circle. Claudius Clyde Charon was a private hunter who specialized in hunting and killing ghosts and other types of undead. He was lucky enough to make enough for a living. For a lot of private hunters, trying to make money was harder than working as a traveling salesman. But lately there have been rumors that Claudius robbed his last client for trying to skip out on a payment. He was dressed in a Kevlar vest with a wide-brim hat, with his 2 pistols at his side within easy reach. His face covered by a bandana with only his eyes truly visible. Talia Tybalt, the true tactician, was a hunter working directly for the Empire of the Seven Cities. Sochi wasn't sure of her exact role to the Emperor, but she was certain it was quite important if she got to wear purple as part of her crest. Unlike Claudius, she had no shortage of work nor resources. She had everything from paid time off that could be measured in months, weapons that could be classified as war crimes if it was ever used outside the Seven Cities, expense reports larger than most people's salaries, and enough paperwork to drown a bureau of bureaucrats. Even now, dressed in her all-black armor and black mask that covered her mouth, she was on a tablet filling out even more paperwork while waiting for the speech to start. Her weapon was a standard infantry rifle with a bayonet, all slung across her back. When Sochi peered around, it took her time until she was able to find the last 2 hunters. In the far back, away from anyone, was Bethany Brixham and Henry Hanno, both isolated from everyone else, with their crest neither a heater nor a circle. It was an oval-shaped cartouche, a symbol that they considered themselves first. Bethany Brixham, the Brigand of Bath, had a green arrow in her cartouche. She was dressed like any traveler in Albion, except for her cap, which had a single raven feather. Sochi was certain, though, despite the casual look, she was well-armored and well-armed. She was infamous for leaving bandits in Albion stealing from the wealthy and gifting much of it to the villagers who either joined or sheltered her. She also led her brigands of bandits to killing monsters that lived on the roads. Some said she did that to help keep the villagers safe. Others said she did that because she didn't like having competition on her roads. But whichever was true, she was here to help liberate the Naglfari. But she still paled in comparison to her companion. Henry Hanno, the navigator, was a large man who carried a lot of strength in his stride. His cartouche was an anchor within a compass. He was famous for taking on the largest monsters the sea had to offer in his modified ship, the Keto, one of the ships of the Vanguard fleet now, willing to help take the Naglfari. He had taken on Kraken, Kaiju, and Chronosaurus all alike. Tales of him taking on city-destroying monsters were legendary, but unlike Bethany, his reasons for hunting the monsters at sea were very clear. He was protecting his business. Henry Hanno, the navigator, was a pirate and a smuggler. Still though, Sochi was confident where all the others stood. They could be trusted as far as the money went. And she didn't need to like the others, she just needed to be able to work with them. And she had to do a lot worse for a lot less with a lot worse in the past. Ian cleared his throat while he finally spoke on his rope box. Welcome everyone. So, I'm Ian Avid. I'm the insurance adjuster for the owners of the Naglfari. So, we think that there's an outbreak of Samedi Syndrome on board the Naglfari. So, you're all hired to clear away the infected. Once it's done, you will be paid 2 million centi each. Are there any questions? He asked the group. Charon called up to Ian. How many sufferers are on board? Well, we have no way to know that. Do you know how we'll clear them all out? Well, I thought you had an idea before now. Do we have any auto-injectors before we go on board? Any what? Ian responded, completely confused. Charon sighed while one of the sailors threw a wet rag at Ian, who looked like he was about to start crying. Thankfully, Maria got out of the crowd and tapped Ian on the shoulder, whispering to him, "Let me take over." Maria's shirt matched both Michikoto and Sochi's chest, but unlike the other two, Maria was staying on the ship, making tactical choices and acting as support. She thankfully managed to do a lot of research before today, so she was ready to answer some questions for the crowd, while Ian quickly did his best to try and disappear. Now, to answer some questions. We don't know how many on board are turned into Samedi Syndrome Sufferers, but the Naglfari was carrying 6,000 people when it left Albion. But with the possibility of survivors, the number is likely lower than that. But still, for tactical reasons, we have to assume the number is as high as 6,000 until proven otherwise. And as for how we're going to clear them all out, the tending ship is missing, so we can send hunters through the tending area, both to evacuate survivors and to clear out the damned. But for clearing out, most of them, we don't need to put ourselves at risk. Henry, you're going to take the Keto to the far side of the Naglfari, and use the speakers to attract as many as you can overboard. The Baron's Bacillus cannot infect a non-humanoid host, so the sharks and the fish will clear them out for us. We should be able to clear out the majority of the sufferers out easily. Well, except for the ones that can't reach the upper decks, the ones that can't hear it, those that are too injured to move or locked away in their rooms. Before Talia could continue, Maria interrupted her. Thank you, Talia, but this is the only way to safely reduce the number of sufferers without either completely destroying the ship or killing all possible survivors. If you have any other better plan that doesn't put others at risk, I am happy to listen. Maria responded, pausing for a moment before Talia sighed and nodded. Okay, that's a good plan, but there's still going to be a lot of sufferers, remember that. Talia finished before Maria continued. At that point, it'll be up to us to clear out the ship. Henry and Bethany will be guarding the tending area. There will be a ship that will connect to the floating hospital. Any survivors will be brought in to be examined by doctors. The uninfected will be evacuated by boat. The infected will receive treatment in the floating hospital until they've all been cleared. This time, it was a doctor who raised their hand and asked, "Wait, treatment? I thought once bitten you became a zombie and nothing could fix that and they had to be put down like a rabid dog." Maria closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Sochi knew that Maria hated dealing with ignorance, especially from those that were supposed to be professionals, and Sochi could feel the painful pang from that profoundly poor proposal. Even the other hunters felt that pain, and they knew it well. After 5 awkward seconds, she finally spoke. "No. Treatment is possible up until the final stage of infection. The Samedi Syndrome Sufferers, or Sufferers for short. While zombie is technically taxonomically true, it's also immeasurably imprecise. There's over 24 forms of undead that we know about. Prometheans, ghouls, somnambulists, revenants, possessed, necrophages, sufferers, and the 11th plague all come to mind. Any one of those can technically be called a zombie by the layman, but it's also so imprecise. Most hunters don't use the term zombie except in the broadest of terms, because words mean things. And a few words can make or break a hunt if we don't understand what we're dealing with. There's times to be precise, and this is certainly one of them. Well, I'm still going to keep calling them zombies," the doctor said, not caring about what Maria just explained. "Very well, nurse. We'll be sure to refer to all illness and injuries as owies while around you." I'm actually a doctor, and it's actually Samedi Syndrome Sufferers, nurse," Maria finished before pivoting to her next statement. Now, treatment for the Baron Bacillus, the bacteria that causes Samedi syndrome, is broad-spectrum antibiotics. There should be enough antibiotics and saline cocktails to cure the Naglfari 3 times over. The hunters are going on in, and all hands are expected to carry auto-injectors. Maria removed a plastic object from her pocket, the size of a large pen. Remember, the orange side gets pressed to the thigh, and you push the blue side. It releases an injection of epinephrine, bacterial interferon, and broad-spectrum antibiotics. The epinephrine keeps the heart going, it opens the lungs, and increases blood pressure, allowing the interferon to keep the bacteria from reproducing, while the antibiotics start to kill the bacteria. Bear in mind, the auto-injectors will not cure the disease, but it will buy time. Anywhere from 15 minutes to 4 hours, depending on the severity of infection. Now, doctors, treat this like a case of flesh-eating disease. Amputation should be an absolute last resort, so only consider it if it's the only way to save the patient. But antibiotics and fluids will be your first and best course of treatment. Now, for tactics with the sufferers. Their primary form of infection is either biting or projectile vomiting, so long range is preferred over everything else. If they're freshly turned, they can move quickly, but after they've been turned for more than an hour, both rigor mortis and necrosis severely slow the sufferers. And of course, severe brain trauma will kill them. Not merely shooting them in the brain, but also smashing their heads into a wall or the ground. The skull doesn't even need to break open to kill them. Their tactics are they usually are solitary hunters, but they can swarm. They aren't intelligent, they can't even use weapons, but they are still dangerous. They like to follow sound and bright lights if they can see it. The ones that can still smell will detect meat, but usually the rot overpowers any other scent. Remember, their bones, teeth, and fingers can still be dangerous. So please, be careful. We don't want to pay out any life insurance policies just yet." That last sentence brought out a nervous laugh in the group. It was a dangerous day doing a dangerous task. Addressing it and making any jokes helped reduce stress and tension. Life insurance policies for these professions paid well, but most hunters didn't have anyone left to benefit from them. Now, vernacular, verbiage, and values aside, remember the 5 priorities on this mission. These are very important. I want everyone from the hands, the help, the hunters, and the hounds to remember and understand this deep in your jellies. Our first priority is the safety of the survivors of Samedi Syndrome Sufferers. Even above your own life, their safety is important. We all agreed to be here. They didn't agree to be a part of this. Their safety comes first. Didn't they pay to be on this boat? The doctor from before asked. They didn't pay to be snapped by sufferers. We're here to help them. Their safety comes first. This was met by quiet nods and murmurs of agreement. Maria waited for a moment for the crowd to quiet down before she continued speaking. Our second priority is ourselves. If there's no passengers at risk, then there's no reason to put ourselves at risk. Our safety is put ahead of the destruction of the dead. If you have a choice between destroying the dead or saving the self, save yourself. If you live to fight another day, you can be here to fight more of the sufferers instead of adding to their ranks. This message was met with murmurs of a very different tone, a more argumentative tone. Quite a few people who joined this mission were fully willing to sacrifice themselves to help someone else, but keeping yourself safe to help someone else was something else entirely. Sochi felt it from the crowd. Those who were comfortable with the idea of helping others, but were so much more uncomfortable with the idea of helping themselves. That was the problem when you had a group of people willing to jump into a bonfire to save a stuffed animal. They were also the kind of people willing to jump into the fire before someone could get a fire extinguisher. So, a firm reminder was needed that keeping yourself safe was also a priority. Not just because keeping yourself safe would give you a chance to save others later, like Maria said, but also because you're a person too. And it would be your responsibility to help keep yourself safe if you're keeping people safe. Yeah, I know, but think about it this way. If you survive, you save more people. This time the grumbles were more of an agreement, as Sochi cuddled more in her husband's embrace. He didn't grumble either time, but Sochi knew why he didn't grumble. Not because he was afraid of sacrifice or death, but because he was scared of leaving Sochi alone in the world. So he kept himself safe, not just for himself, but also for her. And she knew deep in her heart that she loved him deeply, and she also feared leaving him. The third priority is destroying the damned dead. The bacteria can't survive 2 hours without a host. If we can kill them all, then the biohazard crew can come in and clean out the bile, blood, and bodies in safety from Samedi Syndrome. As long as killing the dead isn't going to create harm for yourself or a passenger, feel free to fragment them all. The fourth priority is the reason we're all getting paid. The ship behind us is meant to be in some salvageable shape to sail and sell. Maria gestured to the ship behind her. The ship behind us is bringing in the money for Ian's employer, who pays us. Now, obviously, we're not going to protect the limbo court over human lives, nor are we going to avoid killing a sufferer for standing in front of an open bar. But that doesn't mean you can just smash something because you can, and you cannot loot from the ship. Any reasonable expectation that you're looting from the ship will be deducted from your stipend. That part brought a loud sigh from both Henry and Bridget. They were likely thinking about looting from the ship, but if there was a cost to their theft, it may discourage them from stealing. Or it might be an even greater challenge, because even from so far away, Sochi was certain she could see a bright smile in Bridget's eyes and in the wrinkles of Henry's face. Even without a visible smile, Sochi had her way of figuring what someone was feeling. Those two were terrifying when they were happy, and Sochi was certain that the fourth priority made it worse, not better. "Are there any questions?" Maria asked, her arms crossed, waiting for a question. At first there was silence until the doctor raised her hand and asked, "Didn't you say there were 5 priorities? What's the 5th priority?" the doctor asked Maria. "Well, of course, nurse. The 5th priority is obviously have fun," Maria said, throwing her arms out like she was celebrating a surprise party. That brought another nervous laugh to the group, while the doctor stood there red in face from how angry they were. "Are you ever going to get my title right?" he called out to Maria. Probably not. Now, let's go," she called out, and everyone went to their stations to prepare. Not long after the speech, Sochi sat across from Michikoto with the other hunters, while they waited on the boat for the go-ahead from Maria. On the far side of the Naglfari, the Kido was announcing a very loud, pre-prepared speech to attract the attention of the sufferers, but also to reassure any survivors left on board. "We are here to help you. Even if you are bitten, we can cure you. Stay safe until Vanguard arrives." It was short but simple. After a 2-second pause, it played again. Even though Sochi couldn't see what was happening, she could hear it from her side. Even over the loudspeakers, when the tape was playing, she could hear the sound of a lot of things landing into the ocean. It was nearly continuous for 30 minutes before it turned quiet for the last 5 minutes. Sochi knew it wasn't her fault, but she still felt a tear come into her eyes, even away from the sight. All of the sufferers were dangerous, but she also knew that they were once people. People who were living life and who wanted to just enjoy themselves before it ended so suddenly, and then they became threats to others. Death was already tragic by itself, but death that brings death to others felt like a game of never-ending dominoes. A single death could lead to billions if left alone, but the only way to stop more death was with death and destruction. Maria already explained to Sochi many times that the sufferers were no longer living in a traditional sense, that they were nothing more than bearers of the Baron's Bacillus. But still, the idea of looking into someone's eyes, someone she may very well recognize, or someone she had never seen, and telling that person that they needed to die to prevent more death, felt counterintuitive in her heart, even if it made sense in her head. She felt tears dripping down her cheeks, and she felt her husband's hand resting on her own. "I know it's hard, but it gets easier. We can still keep what happened to them from happening to others. You've never seen one of them before, but once you've seen them, it'll be easier. But just know, no matter what happens in there, you have me with you the entire time." Michikoto reassured her. So she felt his other hand brush away the tear on her cheek. Times like these made Sochi wonder if it was actually Michikoto who was the empath. Sadly, like many other sweet moments, this one was interrupted. "What, are you two planning a pact? Just know, if it's going to get messy in there, do it away from me, please. My clothes are very expensive," Bridget called out to them. Sochi felt Michikoto tense, and then she whispered to him, "Let it go. It isn't worth it." She whispered to her husband, who let out a long exhale, not even dignifying the statement with an acknowledgement, let alone a response. They had dealt with people being rude in all kinds of ways. A lot of people of all kinds of stripes saw people like Sochi and Michikoto as stupid, if not suicidal, for declaring themselves heroes. Acting like a shield for others also meant that you were putting yourself in danger to keep others out of it. But the dangers were not just from the monsters of the world, but oftentimes they came from those that you were protecting. Folks like Claudius and Talia had the advantage of being professionals, so they could argue a contract and stop where the contract ended, but they could do so with a clear conscience when they chose not to do extra to help others. People like Henry and Bridget, however, could be as selfish as they wanted without anyone being surprised by what they did. They could rob a stagecoach, kidnap a royal, create terror across the 7 cities, and no one would bat an eye. They could even decide to do something selfless, like save a ship or save a person's life, and people would assume that it was a normal thing. After all, any action done by a selfish person was inherently a selfish action, even if they were helping someone else, right? But by choosing to call yourself a selfless person, a hero, like her and her husband did, every action was judged by those in front of you that you fought, and by those behind you that you protected and trusted. They would stare, waiting for any chance for you to slip up, any chance to declare that you, the heroes, were secretly villains this entire time. It was frustrating, exhausting, and a great burden. Being a shield meant that you would be struck at by enemies and pushed at by your allies, but it also meant that you were keeping others safe, some of whom would go on to do great things themselves. Even years later, even here in the boat, Sochi still remembered that young girl and shepherd, that light in her eyes, the strength in her stride, and that spark in her heart. Someone who had everything to lose and nothing to gain, and she still pushed forward with everything she had. And she won, snatching her friend from the jaws of sacrifice and spiders. Someone that even years later, her husband and herself still talked about, and they still wonder if she was doing well. Bridget, though, seeing she wasn't getting a response, sighed and stared into the water. "I'm bored. When will we go in?" she whined, just as the radio crackled to life and Maria's voice came through. "You're clear. Tender and clear. Good luck, team. Out," Maria said as the boat drifted to the tending area. As they approached, Michikoto readied his crossbow. It was a modified crossbow of his own design. It held up to 13 bolts and could be reloaded in seconds. Each bolt was carbon fiber with obsidian tips, each tip matching the obsidian crystal Michikoto kept around his neck. Sochi saw him kill many dangerous creatures with that crossbow, and knew for certain it was an Olympia-class weapon. The obsidian was blessed by a god. Sochi's weapons were a bit simpler. She had her knives, and she had plenty of them, hardened carbon steel, and she carried over 2 dozen, including her throwing knife. Her largest knife, that she jokingly referred to as Sunset, rested in her right hand as the boat made contact in the tending area. Her only other weapon was herself. The tending area was a room that was once white, with rows upon rows of cloth barriers for showing where people would stand in line to make it to the tending boat before heading to shore. But now, the barriers were all knocked down, and the floors and wall were covered with brown blood. In the movies, blood was always red, even hours or days afterward. But the reality was far grosser. Blood still coagulates and dries, so it often turned brown, especially after exposure to the Baron's bacillus. The room smelled really bad, like a rotting butcher shop. But fortunately all the hunters had the foresight to rub menthol under their noses to reduce the smell. Unfortunately, it made everything smell like mint. "Looks clear, let's go," Michikoto said, stepping into the tending area first, followed by everyone else. He led to the door, standing just to the side, gesturing to Sochi. "You first," he said with a smile. This wasn't a courtesy, like ladies first at the mall. This had an actual tactical advantage, and Sochi took a deep breath and closed her eyes as she pressed her hand against the door. She let her senses feel what was behind, trying to see if there was any presence nearby that might be a threat. It worked best with people, but in her experience it also worked with monsters almost as well. After a few beats, she withdrew her hand and spoke. "No immediate threat, but there is one about 30 meters to the left, about 296 degrees," Sochi told her husband, who nodded and opened the door and immediately loosed the bolt at Sochi's predicted location. Sure enough, there was a sufferer there. It was too far for Sochi to see it clearly, but it looked like it was dressed in a bikini that used to be white, but was now stained with various body fluids. But it was now dead again, and they could all breathe easily. "Everyone remembers their roles?" Michikoto asked the group. They nodded as they began to split up. Michikoto and Sochi would take the parts of the ship that were above the waterline. Claudius Clyde Caron and Talia Tybalt would be taking all the ship below the waterline, while Henry Hanno and Bridget Brixham would be guarding the tending area to help protect the escape route and the floating hospital that was docking to the boat in the tender area. Following the hallway around the desk, Sochi and Michikoto paid careful attention, wanting to leave as little to surprise as possible. On this deck was a restroom. The first room was empty, a bit dirty, but no more than was to be expected. There wasn't even blood in it. The second restroom, though, was a different story altogether. It looked locked on the inside, but they were uncertain if there was anyone still inside. So, naturally, Sochi pressed her hand against the door to see what she could feel. Behind the door, a few feet away, she could feel someone curled up on the ground, but she couldn't tell if they were living or dead. Just that they were there, and they were likely hurt. Shaking her head to Michikoto, she decided to try something else. Sochi knocked on the door. "Is there anyone there? If you're all right, please knock once. If you need help, please knock twice," she said. She was hopeful it was someone who needed help, but with the door closed like this, everything was uncertain. The door could be hiding someone who was sick and injured, but managed to get away, and now they were desperate for some kind of help, and hearing Sochi's voice was a blessing. Or, alternatively, what was in there used to be someone who was injured, someone who managed to lock the door thinking that they were keeping a dangerous threat away from the rest of the ship. But now, they were the threat. But right now the door was closed, and right now the person behind it was both dead and alive until it was opened and verified. It came from near the floor, but that brought relief to both Sochi's heart, and she could see the relief on Michikoto's face also. "Back away from the door. I'm going to break it down now," Sochi warned. After giving it a few moments and confident that the person on the other side was safe, she balled her hand into a fist and drew it back. The doors on the restroom were made of steel. Their door handles were also steel, with a deadbolt that was supposed to be able to hold back over 400 pounds of force. It took Sochi one punch to break through and allow herself to unlock the door. Opening the door let the light onto one terrified young man. "What are you?" he asked, staring at the damage of the door and the lack of damage on Sochi's fist. Sochi relaxed her fist and lifted her hand out to the man on the floor. "I'm with Vanguard. We're here to get you out. Do you have any bites? We have treatment if you're bitten." No bites, and you're with Vanguard. Does that mean the Coastal Guardians are here?" he asked. Sochi could tell he was too flustered to even try to lie. He also didn't have any visible bites and no veins that were starting to turn necrotic. He reached out to her hand while she helped pull him up. "No, sadly the Coastal Guardians are all still in Isle City. Doesn't mean we aren't here to help you," Sochi said as both her and Michikoto helped guide the man back to the ship. He was still in shock and he was not speaking, but instead he just focused walking step by step. Finally, back in the tender area, the Vanguard took the man off their hands and took him back to the hospital ship. The man safe, Sochi and Michikoto turned back to the ship and continued their sweep. The rest of the deck that was at the waterline was empty, so they first opened the elevators and found them blood-smeared but empty. So they continued their trek up via the stairs. The Naglfari had two major sets of stairs, one in the stern and one in the bow. The plan was to take the bow stairs first up to the top deck of the ship, and then clear it out, heading down via the stairs in the stern. Starting in the bow and ending in the stern meant that the sun was always behind them and not blinding them. It also worked against the Samedi Sufferers. They weren't attracted to sunlight like they were artificial light, but their eyes were still very human, so even they could be blinded by the sun. Now on the top deck, both Sochi and Michikoto could see the dead underneath. Down below in some sort of open-air atrium? Sochi was unsure of the term, but it was the big open-air area where most of the pools, slides, and kid zone and play areas were offloaded on the Naglfari. She could see that there were still sufferers striding and struggling along. "How many do you see?" Michikoto asked while he removed his backpack and braced his crossbow to the top of the railing to give himself more stability. There were more than a few out there, and taking the opportunity to snipe them before they could be a threat would make it much easier to clear out any survivors that were still on board. Sochi glanced over the sufferers below and quickly did a count. It didn't take long, but she gave her count to her husband. "I count 38 sufferers. There's likely more in the dark area of the hallways, but that is how many I can see on the deck below, so you got this," she said, placing a reassuring hand on his back for a moment while he focused through his scope. "Please watch my back," he asked her while his breaths decreased and his focus increased. Sochi was familiar with this state of her husband's. He was focusing everything he had in his shots. His breath slowed as he figured every shot before it occurred. He was considering everything from the wind, the motion of the cruise ship, the location of his target, gravity, the curvature of the planet, and even his breath and heartbeat were all factors that were going into his shots. And not a single one could afford to miss. Michikoto let out another exhale and loosed a bolt. He then inhaled, and when he exhaled, another bolt was released before the sufferers could notice that the others of their kind were dropping. This specific tactic of Michikoto's was called the breath and death. After every inhale, he lined his next shot, and with every exhale, he fired. His breath was slow, and the death he brought was quick. Less than a minute, he reloaded and then was firing again, all in one fluid motion. No distractions from within or without. A few minutes later, 38 bodies laid still on the deck. Michikoto waited in silence before he whispered to Sochi. "Do the 5-word test," he said while he waited for anyone or anything else that was about to come out. It would be Sochi's job to do the 5-word test. "Does the black moon howl?" Sochi called out. The howls that echoed back were certainly not from the black moon, even if they were unsettling enough to come from it. And sure enough, 6 sufferers slouched and slunk from the ship's shadows and straight into Michikoto's shots. Soon they struggled no more, and Michikoto nodded to Sochi, asking for her to do another 5-word test. "Does the black moon howl?" she called out, and the only response was her own echo before her husband stood and gave his response. "Only when she bleeds." "Are you all right?" she asked, examining him to see if there were any cuts or injuries. "I'm fine. Every bolt found its mark. Now, let's go find ours," Michikoto said before wincing at his word choice. "I mean, we go find survivors now," he said as they continued down and through the ship. And this was where things got very depressing in Sochi's opinion. There were almost no survivors. There were a few. A kids zone attendant with 2 children and a father with his 2 children, but no one else was found. Room after room, seemingly never-ending nightmare from Lockhart. Room after room they knocked, and Sochi checked, only to find out there was no body inside, or worse, that there were bodies inside, but no survivors. One particularly harsh room was full of children, with an older man in red and a white beard, who was dead in the corner, too devoured to come back as a sufferer. The children all had torn remnants of ropes around their arms and chests. The rope burns on their arms and the shattered piece of rope along the floor, along with where the bites were placed, made it very clear. These children were tied up for a long time before infection hit, and then the children turned on each other, one after another, before they all broke out and attacked the man, all at once. Sochi couldn't watch while her husband did what he had to do, and she stood outside the room looking at the many bodies on the deck and in the hallway. They were easier to deal with than with the children inside. Michikoto and Sochi were hunters. They destroyed monsters and they were heroes. They protected people. But times like this, where the monsters and the people were clearly reversed, she could barely breathe. The world wasn't supposed to be this harsh, or at least she was supposed to be stronger to handle it. Both of those things felt so false in moments like this. What she felt was Michikoto's warm hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said, embracing her. Sochi could feel it inside of him. He was taking it hard too. Even if he wasn't showing it on the outside, didn't mean that it wasn't affecting him too. But they wouldn't have long before they had to continue and face even more monsters of the Naglfari. But they could be together for a moment. When they stopped holding each other and Michikoto pulled Sochi up, they both knew it was time to keep going. Things weren't better, not by any means, but they knew that they could face what was happening. They could talk about it later, and they would focus on the problems in front of them and not let the worries of the past bother them. If they could focus on what was in front of them, they could ignore everything behind them. Ahead of them was the control room. Unlike most doors on the ship, it was neither broken down nor sealed. It was open and it had blood on the floor and door, but the captain and crew were nowhere to be seen. Michikoto gestured forward. "Let's see if we can find the black box. It'll let us know what happened. There's no way so many people refused to quarantine." "Did they?" he asked, leading forward while Soichi followed behind listlessly. As soon as Michikoto stepped through the door, on the other side, just out of sight, a necrotic arm grabbed his neck and pulled him towards sharp teeth. Michikoto, in a panic, fired his bolt wildly, and it struck the window, creating a loud crack, and he screamed even louder from the pain as scarlet blood began to flow down his shoulder. The sufferer screeched in glee from the smell and tried to tear into Michikoto like a rabid animal. While Michikoto's right arm was pinned down with his crossbow pointing away, and his left arm, with his shoulder injured, could only weakly push the sufferer back by pressing his hand against its foul face. Soichi had no time to think about what she was doing. All she could do was react. She drew her blade, Sunset, from its sheath and threw it with all of the force she could muster. The blade buried itself up to its hilt in the sufferer's skull. The sharp blade he struck between Michikoto's fingers as the sufferer fell to the ground with its open entrails dragging after itself. Michikoto held his shoulder while Soichi ran towards him. "Are you bitten?" she asked, worried about him. "No, but my crossbow bolt," he started but stopped, barely able to stand. He kept pressing his shirt into his wound on his shoulder, which was still flowing with blood. Soichi understood then, though. Every bolt that was fired from that crossbow would draw blood. That was the price for using the blessed obsidian as the arrow tip. If the bolts didn't draw blood from a target, then it was Michikoto who paid the blood price. "I'll get you off the ship," she promised while she crouched down and lifted him onto his shoulders. His left arm held in her arms, and his right arm elevated. Like she was a firefighter, she carried him with ease. "But the mission, our priorities are to second priority. We save people, and you're a person, Mitch," Soichi reminded him as she strode out of the captain's quarters, her thoughts on keeping him safe. "That's the only time you get to call me that," he joked in her ear as she was out in the hallway. Already she was trying to plot a way out to the floating hospital. Realizing it was going to take too long to take the hallway, Soichi peered over the railing and she could see the open path to the floating hospital. Only 8 floors down. "Mitch, I need you to close your eyes," she warned him. He didn't argue. He was tired, but he trusted her and he loved her. He knew when she said to close his eyes that he would need to listen and not argue. Soichi, confident in her husband's closed eyes, stood up on the railing, took a deep breath, and then took one final step forward. The free fall was peaceful, even relaxing at first, almost like being on a ride. A moment of weightlessness and a feeling that you were flying, that anything in the world was possible, and for a moment it was truly at peace with the universe. But then gravity caught up, and then you felt heavy as the sky tried to push you up and the earth tried to pull you down. And every time, the earth won. Or, in Soichi's case, the earth almost always won. As she fell and fell, she let her strength flow through her. She felt the air push futilely against her, but she didn't let it be futile. Her fear for her husband and her love for her husband gave her the strength as she commanded the air between her and the rapidly approaching ground. She imposed her will upon it and ordered it, "Catch us." And the air obeyed. Sochi slowed down as she approached the ground floor, and when she landed it was with a thud, and she was still able to run forward with her husband on her shoulders, and her eyes now open when he felt the thud. He knew of what his wife was capable of doing, but he did possess a fear of falling, which she didn't want to set off when she jumped from the top deck to the bottom deck. In her experience, people going through experiences like that were more likely to be upset by the falling and a lot less impressed by the fact that they were not falling. Running her husband to the floating hospital, she blew past the hunters on guard and took him to a nearby bed. "He's hurt. He needs help," she called out to the waiting doctors while setting him on the bed. And they rushed towards him, and she took a step back. She was confident he would get better, but she also knew the importance of getting him treatment quickly. She sat on a stool in the waiting room near his bed, while the doctors had to perform surgery on his shoulder, and she couldn't be in the room while the surgery was done. They threw out a lot of terms she didn't understand, but what she did understand was that an artery was torn, and that if he was even a few minutes later, he would not have survived. Sochi sat in the chair, her leg jostling up and down, while waiting for the news if he was going to be all right. While she waited, she saw Maria approach with 2 cups of coffee. She sat next to Sochi, and the two of them were silent for a moment, while Maria sipped on a cup before she finally spoke. "The ship has been cleared. We ship out in an hour," she told Sochi, who only nodded in response. "Hey, he's going to pull through. He's been through worse," Maria offered, Sochi, who only nodded. "I'm sorry," Maria finally said, as Sochi felt something catch in her throat, and she just started sobbing and laughing at the same time. The fear, the danger, the anxiety, the absurdity of the entire last day finally caught up with her. She was finally safe, and she was finally allowed to have her panic and crash. Maria let her cry for a few minutes before Sochi calmed down enough to ask, Is he infected?" Sochi asked. Maria shook her head in response. "No, he was safe. He just got caught by the bolts. I keep telling him it's too dangerous to use those, but he's so insistent that the price of blood was a fair price for such a good weapon," Maria said, and Sochi giggled some at that statement. "Or how he throws himself into danger first. He knows what I am and what I can do, but he's still so willing to throw himself into danger first to keep me out of it, even if it doesn't hurt me," Sochi said, looking down at her hands. The same hands that broke steel and took a life and carried her love's life. All feats that would break a normal person. And her hands still looked normal as ever. They weren't even calloused. Her hands should be broken, bloody, or bruised. But here she was, whole as ever, and her husband was paying the price. "You know why he does that, right?" "Because he knows you hate fighting," Maria said as she sipped at her coffee. "Yeah, but he's caring like that. But I wish he considered the price of things first. It's like he'd sacrifice everything he has just to keep you safe." "Yeah, exactly." Maria sipped at her coffee again and told Sochi, "That's because you're his entire world. He'd give up on the entire world before he dreams about giving up on you," Maria finished. They sat in silence for a while before Sochi reached out for Maria's second cup of coffee, just as Maria drew her hand back. Whoa, 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 whoa. What are you doing? That's my coffee. You have two coffees. My coffee, Maria said as she drank from her second cup, bringing a smile to Sochi's face. Michikoto's cousin did love her coffee. But before the great coffee conflict could continue, Ian approached them both. Well, I have some news for you both. First, I just got done with my adjustment. My employers will be able to salvage quite a bit from Naglfari. As of this time tomorrow, Major Goal Inc. will own the Naglfari and all of its contents. He and Avid told them both. Also, the doctors wanted me to tell you Michikoto is going to be okay. The doctor said he'll need to take it easy for a few weeks, but he'll be alright. Sochi stopped caring about the coffee with those words and smiled. That's wonderful, she said. She was so happy with the second piece of news. She had no time to think about the first piece of news. As the sun began to set on the Naglfari and on the hunters who helped clear it.